All righty. Hello, 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 people. Hello, world. Welcome back to What the Future. It's been a while, but we're ready to go, revamped, recharged, and with a fantastic topic today. What the speech communication, talking about privacy and anonymity, as well as control over communication and the way you communicate to people, to individuals, what the future of that looks like, what tech looks like. We'll start from a historical perspective and move up to modern times a bit with this as well, including touching on some things that have been pretty relevant in the news, from Elon's tussle with Brazil to Telegram founder Pavel Durov being arrested in France. There's a lot of little things that we can discuss, but the essence of this episode is speech, freedom of speech, privacy with speech, communications, how that's evolving, what it looks like today, and why it's so important. So welcome back. I'm Brandon. Sam, how you doing? Got you
What's
on too?
up? What's up? I've missed everyone, our massive audience. It's good to see you.
All right. So where should we start? Should we start from a bit of a historical perspective, maybe talk about, how speech has kind of evolved over time, communication has evolved over time, going back, probably thousands of years to what, like stone tablets, the Rosetta Stone itself, not the one online where you can learn a new language, but the actual stone tablet, to the Gutenberg printing press, to broadcasting, to the internet itself today. It's changed quite a lot, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's wild to think what we've accomplished as human beings. And I often, when I have the opportunity to share stories on stage about the future, I often frame where we are today through this historical perspective of speech and communication, no matter what technology we're talking about. Because honestly, communication, and not just in terms of the formation of spoken or written language, but particularly writing, is the basis, or was the basis, so the dominant narrative would say, of human civilization. So if we rewind, honestly, I mean, well, 2 million years, if in like that perspective, we're talking about people, early human, wielding fire and stone tools. So this was still where we were communicating in different ways, either through dance or grunting, but there wasn't really like formal language. And then it moved into the ancient Sumerians. So this is like way, 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 way back, dawn of stone tablets, the Assyrian language. And really, it's funny, we both come from a space that is so interested in these distributed ledgers, because actually the dawn of human writing was basically a ledger. So people recording when to plant and harvest the crops, or record transactions between each other for early trade. So I get really obsessed with these ancient communication networks, which were basically pieces of stone with etchings on them. Because that led to the creation of human civilization, people stopping from being nomadic to coming together. Now, of course, we have a lot of things that happen in the middle. This is like 100,000 years ago. And I don't want to fast forward through all of history. A lot of things happened in between, like, let's see, the invention of paper. And this was by the Chinese in the Age of Exploration. I don't remember specifically the dates, but I'm just trying to give us a benchmark.
Yeah.
The movement of people with that paper on ships. And I suppose papyrus was also in existence at this time in Egypt. But again, you mentioned the Gutenberg press, the printing press. So this is when late 1300s, 1400s.
First book was the Mass.
Johann, the Bible.
Was it the Bible? Yeah.
Yeah, and so this ushered in, of course, like the Renaissance, and basically before that, the Catholic Church, or educated literary elites who could read in Latin would, share the word of the Lord through them. right? An educated elite versus decentralizing information directly to the people, as in print the Bible and put the Bible in the uneducated masses' hands, which had a huge hand in the Protestant Reformation and everything that came after it. So again, we started to see this trend of decentralization of information. You could say books being an early communication platform. And there were early, I mean, this led to like revolutions, right? The French Revolution, American Revolution, of the way to print and share information. It was completely chaotic. And then we had, things that happened after that, whether that's radio or telephones or broadcasting, and all of the rules that came with it, right? And regulations. In the US, the creation of the Federal Communication Commission, FCC. And I checked this just to fact check myself if there are international standards bodies, which we can get into. There aren't any specific ones, but there are a few. Which then led us to basically this internet era, in the globalized era that we're in. Right before this happened, there was kind of the telecoms revolution. So again, telephones, telephone numbers, and even putting those in people's houses and, of course, their pockets. And there was a debate then around is a phone number one-to-one representative of your unique identification? And this has been a long debate in the telecoms world that is still not really solved. So we see different countries around the world that require you give identification to get a SIM card for your phone, so a phone number. And there are some countries that you can buy it, cash out of a vending machine, not attached to an ID. So this is sort of setting the stage of very long human history of communication platforms, starting with rocks and moving to this version of some rocks. And then thinking ahead, right? What goes beyond just this debate. So we're like framing ourselves in this moment, the moment being debates around the internet or this phase of the internet. So, kind of the end of the second generation or Web 2, moving into things that might be, alternatives, Web 3 or even beyond. And then we have this other kind of out there discussions around satellite communication or cybernetics, so enhancing the body or augmenting the body, perhaps with communication technologies. We already, many people walk around with in-ear monitors called headphones all day long, augmenting their communication. And so what happens when we're able to augment further, and people might choose to put brain machine interfaces or chips, and what does happen, like what happens with communication then? But also, again, looking ahead, this puts into perspective why the debates right now around privacy, autonomy, identity versus anonymity are so important. And they were kind of in the early internet as well. But now, as we see the interfaces, the tools we use to communicate with each other getting closer to in or on our bodies, it really begs the question, who can control the rights to your innermost thoughts that are not even communicated? So that's a very long-winded introduction to frame where we're going to start, which is internet communication platforms and communication apps or messengers. But really, I think we're going to start right with communication over the internet.
What I find fascinating, just to touch on it real quick, is the level of syndication, how that has gone up over time. Syndication of information, a firsthand source, seeing something, hearing about something, learning about something, a few thousand years ago, writing it on a stone tablet or an early version of paper, or putting it into the very first and probably only book and edition. And then something like the Gutenberg press comes around, and all of a sudden it gets replicated hundreds upon thousands to the masses. And and what that has done also to communication as well. Because you used to have these primary sources, but once syndication has started to go up and up, and after that you had, you know, broadcasting mediums, you had the internet, you have things just multiply it constantly, and information seemingly starting to get misrepresented or diluted, or errors starting to occur, or people even taking their own takes on something and creating a similar work. You know, it's interesting over time to see, I think, how that has changed from being something we've relied on so much to something that's gone, you know, closer and farther to the end of almost fiction or mythological, or, you know, just straight up legend. Like if you learn about Roman times, for example, like here's a good example. Most people look to the accounts of an individual called like Livy. You know, there's famous authors and producers from way back then, and we look to their original accounts that have gotten replicated over time. But you go through and you read some of that stuff, and it doesn't even make sense or even sound practical, and there's nothing historical to back up certain sources that are made. But we rely on it because it was the only thing that, you know, we could rely on. We want to learn about the Punic Wars with Rome, for example. But, you know, as those sources have continued to, I think, get further syndicated and further copied, it's kind of opened up the door, you know, for that communication to grow, but also for it to be slightly manipulated too. And I think it's something interesting, but to keep in mind, you know, as communication continues to grow and expand to the point where it just goes right into our head, whether it's Neuralink or a competitor that it has, which I will post on our Twitter page later this week. I found something pretty cool in regards to that. So Neuralink won't be the only one. There will be competitors. But I think it's very fascinating that information is so fluid these days compared to how hardbound it used to be, you know, just a few hundred years ago, 1,000 years ago. And I think that has also spun up some of the debates and arguments and controversies around the ideas of communication too. Figured it's worth noting. It's just an interesting thing to kind of reflect upon.
That's a great point. I was, you know, it's like the game of telephone, right? And when we now are in this context where we're at just the beginning of, you know, tools, you know, artificial intelligence or chatbot based tools at the level of massive automation, of amplifying information and knowledge, whether that's through, as we were discussing, you know, bot squadrons. So this is, you know, you could spin up 10,000 accounts very quickly and then amplify something, and get it to a wider audience, or just creating, again, information that may or may not be, I want to say factual, but this is not the word I mean, because it right now we're in this time of questioning truth with a capital T. And I think the debate that we'll get into here starts to get into this territory of terminology like misinformation or disinformation, two different terms describing different things, one of which just being inaccurate information, and one being intentionally creating inaccurate, which is disinformation. You know, one is like, oh, a bit negligent and accidental, another is intentional. But, you know, and then the weaponization of these terms to control or suppress information. You know, it's really easy to just say misinformation, like, you know, where's the data, and then the fabricated data to back it up. So we're in this context. And, you know, I'll tell a quick little story. When I was traveling quite a bit and doing field work on the side, writing my book on the side, and I had noticed some weird things happening, because I picked up a Mexican SIM card, and I'm not going to blame that country, but it was more like I had put in a new SIM card and some weird things started happening on my device. And I'm, you know, aware of things more than most people with, you know, in the nature of, let's say, like technology or cybersecurity. And I kind of was convinced for a second that, a bit paranoid, like I had been intercepted or something, but it was a whole experience. My WhatsApp got crazy, weird messages coming in that did not sound like my family members and stuff. So I was like, called them and said, and this was right when also ChatGPT, people were asked, it had just come out, OpenAI's chatbot, and they didn't know what to do. So they're asking me all this feedback. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, I'm sort of like freaking out. I'm not telling people this, but I'm saying, I don't even know if like someone is sending me text messages and it's really the person I think it is, because it's not hard to fabricate another account or a social media account, all of these spoofs. And I started to see more and more happening in my own personal life, just from some of my other like more public facing brands and stuff. And I started saying this to people. And this was when I like raised the alarm around deepfakes, because it's really easy to deepfake text on a platform, impersonate someone. It's becoming way easier now to deepfake. So replicate someone's voice and then likeness. Like I'm on, it's not so famous couch. No, famous couches are not a good story anymore. But no, I created a deep fake of myself, like right here. And there is imagery on the internet of that experience. And so, now it's kind of funny, is like, clearly this is me, but in theory, it could not be. So we're again in this context where on one hand, we have this like incredible globally connected network called the internet. Though it is different depending on the countries that you're in, right? Because, despite what some people might think, it's not just floating out in the clouds. It's wires that are under the ocean. It's under, right, like various parts of the subterranean, like parts of land, and their internet service providers. And they all have different regulations in every country, and debates around that. In the US, we had debates around net neutrality. So the ability, this is what, the 2000s, I don't know, a little before my time, but of like deciding whether those internet service providers and telecoms operators could like slow down or throttle individuals' access to information or not, which is kind of, we don't have to get into that intense debate, but it laid the groundwork for where we are now. And then we have, again, all of these different tools and technologies to spread information quickly, whether that information is accurate or inaccurate. It isn't really for me to debate. It's more of what is the role of the platform, right, in allowing for that to happen or not, to deplatform or kick people off or not, to censor ideas or not, to flag or curate ideas with community notes or not, to police for things like criminal activity or not. And, this debate started very early on, again, around, is it a fundamental human right to access the communication platform, or is it a public utility regulated like energy utilities and water utilities, or is it something else?
Absolutely. We noticed a lot of that stuff start to come to surface back when Elon first bought Twitter before it became X. And they dumped all these files, internal communications, code logic, all this information from inside of Twitter on how they went about regulating content, essentially. And it was very fascinating to see, because I think a lot of us were skeptical about what social media platforms do today. And this is not to pick on, Twitter back in the past, but I think a lot of social platforms do this to their own degree. But they had parameters. And if, person A were to say something in regards to topic X, or they would do certain things or act a certain way, then there's consequences. And I think, there's probably a place for that on platforms, because we want a place where we can speak freely and be comfortable and not have to worry, about bad things happening, because there's a lot of bad things people could do on social media. Things that may be inappropriate, uncomfortable, not conducive of a healthy conversation. But again, who gets to make that decision is another issue. Like, even if you're on the side of, maybe we should, be careful with communications. Maybe we should censor certain things. Like, maybe we should have some restrictions. Like, if you believe that, that's okay. I believe there's a degree to that should be in place in public forums, or else it's just chaos. But at the same time, who gets to make that decision? Who gets to say what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what's okay? And it feels like that line is getting blurred all the time. And we saw that with Twitter when those files got released to the public, and it was quite surprising how they would go about determining that stuff. Some of that was very partisan and politically motivated. Some of that was just people having a viewpoint, and, point A is always better than point B in their opinion. And, it's very dangerous. We're seeing that in AI as well. A lot of people testing out, ChatGPT and Google's Gemini and other LLMs that are out there, and finding a lot of biases. And, you got to ask the question, how do we build in safeguards, and how do we protect speech without imposing our own viewpoints? And I think that's where the line gets very, very blurred. And, even if we would hope that we'd have some like neutral AI to do it, can we trust someone to build out an AI that's truly neutral? We live in this circle where we contradict ourselves constantly on how to go about doing that. Because even if I think I'm the most independent and fair individual, I'm probably not, because there's people that don't agree with everything that I believe. So it's, how do you do that in a fair, I guess, equitable manner for everybody? Or can you? And should you just leave things be? It's an interesting crossroad.
I mean, it needs to be open and decentralized, at least as an attempt. I'm not saying that's the answer, right? But it's been a proposed answer for quite some time now, coming out of multiple communities, whether it's cypherpunk, open source, crypto, Web3. They get a bad name, right? Because this is starting as being a bit fringy and almost anarchistic or libertarian, but it's without these communities having existed in the past, and that formed again around this early net neutrality debate. We're seeing the old school cypherpunk, open source, and I kind of came up through that world, which led me in the gaming world a little bit, but like more as an observer, not participant, which of course led me into understanding the values of the Bitcoin white paper beyond just, I don't want to say just the global economy, it's the most important thing, but beyond that too, of the ideas of decentralization and why we're at this moment, this breakdown of trust in centralized institutions. Because this is what happened in the information age and the era of globalization, is that it got so far reaching our human networks, right? We used to speak face to face in a local village or community. So
what are we doing?
Right. So there were these debates, and yes, there would be like the crazy traveling storytellers, that would show up and be like, I'm a bard and I'm going to sing you a song about something in a far off land. And, and they'd either be like booted, executed, or welcomed in. I think, right, when we shifted into this globalized world, and whether for better or worse, right, because we're now seeing the pushback on that, and I don't debate that. It already happened, right? We can sit there and be like, no, what? The important thing is now we're in this context of a very complex environment with varying levels of incentives, whether they're economic or corporate incentives, from the private sector, whether they are regulatory incentives or political incentives, whether there's political corruption, which there is everywhere, right, with these trust gaps. So it's almost impossible to manage one of these systems without taking an approach of decentralizing the platform, changing the business model, and also revisiting, like decentralizing the technology backbone of it, which is often overlooked and not discussed. But when we're talking about like how we're streaming right now and how we're broadcasting, we're using a centralized company that's running on centralized servers, probably Amazon AWS or something like that, right?
Probably.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked, but and your servers are not even your own that are hosting all of this for people. I won't go into a technology lesson, but then you're like, where, then what's piping this behind the scenes? It's again, cables, and these are regulated by people. They're also now that we're in a tense geopolitical environment, we see examples of also attacks, underwater attacks on internet cables in the ocean. Like it's really quite archaic when you think about it. And there are lots of opportunities to control it, manipulate it, change it, deplatform. We're not just talking about a system admin at X or at Telegram being like, delete your account, delete that. Yes, individuals can do this. But when the entire technology stack is also subject to these same forces, this is complex, which is where it is sort of exciting to see as this pushback. We're in this moment, and then meanwhile, Elon Musk has the largest satellite network in the world. It's coming from the private sector, which is offering. Theoretically, it could offer direct access to kind of a network for people around the world, therefore to communicate via a communication platform, whether that's X or it's a device that they create. From my understanding, Starlink still has to route through internet service providers on the ground. I was talking to someone about this the other day, so it's secondhand knowledge. We'll have to look up the actual information, but it would make sense. It depends on the regulatory environment, but it's not like satellite is beaming things down here, though that would be ideal.
Interesting, though. I'd be curious to see what they're doing in particular. I'd like to dig into it because I know that they have partnerships that they've announced with T-Mobile for backup satellite connectivity if you are roaming or you don't have T-Mobile connection on their network. And then now with United Airlines, so you can now use internet for free on United Airlines. So I'd be very curious to see what they're using in terms of servers, but also what other existing telecom networks maybe they tap into, or if they really are doing this separately. Because I know Elon likes to build out his own infrastructure, but that part is a good question. So they're getting stuff from somewhere.
If I had to guess what the future and ponder, I think there's probably a parallel track, right? There's probably the infrastructure in place that is capable of direct peer-to-peer communication or satellite to recipient communication, or routed through the satellites. That would be illegal from a regulatory perspective, I think, in pretty much any environment. So these tests that we're seeing, the example with T-Mobile being used for emergency services and being positioned from a PR perspective as well, like, oh no, emergency. Well, the second that there's some sort of black swan emergency and that gets turned on, then maybe we see, I'm sorry, I'm not suggesting that would happen, but
no worries.
It's more like it's probably there and it's not being used, as with many technologies that are built in gray areas, regulatory gray areas, where they're not ready for prime time. So there are experiments and things like that.
What's cool is I live in Colombia. For those out there that don't know, I live in Colombia. Doxing myself here, telling you where I live. But
I'm just in a different location each time that looks the same, just moving around.
I mean, I could probably get away saying anywhere with this dark room of a box that I have a studio in. No one would really know if I never told anybody. But what's really cool is they have Starlink here now. And I went into Home Center the other day, which is like Home Depot here. And they have the physical devices just sitting there at the front door when you come in. It's like $200 to buy the kit. And then you can set it up, and it's like $30, $40 a month on the initial plan. And you can get up to like 200 megabits a second. It's pretty good for satellite. Like I have like 500 megabits in my house right now, but I only get like 40, 50 at a time. Like, I don't know why, but the internet companies like throttle it. But I was really tempted the other day, really tempted to go get the Starlink kit and set it up and see, but I might have to just to play around and give it a go. But it's cool because even in places that aren't considered necessarily a first world country, you know, this stuff is becoming very accessible for people and quite popular. And it's almost making the internet feel quite archaic in the way that the infrastructure stack is laid out, talking about the cables running under the oceans. And I was talking with someone today, I was recording another podcast episode for Blockhash, and we were talking about decentralized telecom, and how fiber optic is starting to get obsolete as well. And fiber optic used to be the gold standard for a long time. Everything's going to go wireless. And not just that, but I think what we'll see a lot of is DY is starting to get bigger and bigger. And I think being able to have wireless systems and wireless groups connected through telecom as well is going to just expand, you know, global reach. And then you plug in satellite into that. And I think cables will just completely disappear very soon. We're very close. But connectivity just keeps going up. It just keeps getting more and more connected, not less.
That's very provocative to say that the cables, it's like a Tesla, the first Tesla argument. But there's beeping. Can you hear the beeping? Can people hear the beeping?
A little bit.
You know, that also makes me think about the movement of people. So you had mentioned again with Starlink being available on previously hard to reach places, whether you're 34,000 feet in the air on an airplane or the top of not a mountain. There's no mountain that tall, but you know, up on a mountain.
There's a guy sailing across the Pacific Ocean. I don't know if he made it or not. I think he did because I stopped tuning in, but he had a little makeshift sailboat with a Starlink setup kit on his sailboat. And he was on TikTok documenting day by day his journey across the Pacific Ocean. I was just like, we're already in a completely different age. That is insane. Who could imagine that?
I've thought about living on, I've had these adventures a few times, but most of mine are on the land and like deep into a jungle, as you know. And, you know, even some of the places I've been, like, let's say a very remote village in the Amazon or other places where, you know, they had to like literally bringing in fiber was a huge deal. It was a massive undertaking. There's still so many people around the world that don't have internet access. The last I remember, I mean, this is 2020 when I was the CEO of a communication platform. So I did learn a little bit, but I don't have the data, but it was still only 2 billion people or something. It wasn't like the full 8 billion people. And, you know, if you think about the time in history, right, we started this with like a long time ago, but going back to the printing press and that being the first instance, really, well, not first, but like really another technology that supercharged the proliferation and access to information. It's sort of like we're in this era again where there is a massive population in the world that doesn't yet have this access, or they're unbanked as well, or they lack identity. And what will that do, right, for the ability to democratize that information or learning or pretty much anything? I think that's pretty cool. I think on the flip side, we're definitely going to see more of movement of people to different locations, more remote locations that would have been previously harder to kind of set up infrastructure in this whole trend of digital nomads or network states. Is more like the technologist terminology around it, which I'm not so sure if I'm for or against. I don't have I do have some strong opinions on it, but I think it could go one of two ways. But really, it's just the movement of people to these other locations as well, enabled by these technologies and this access.
Yeah. If you look at like a heat
map,
if you look at like a heat map of like the US and where people tend to congregate and live, it's generally in high populous and very dense zones within major cities. And it makes sense. And generally they do that, one, because of access to information, access to the internet, and then ease of lifestyle. Whereas if you lived, in Wyoming or Montana or North Dakota, it's not like the Middle Ages out there, but it's much, much harder to get the same, efficacy that you would get in a city. It's not like you can get 2-hour Amazon delivery in the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma, but you live in Los Angeles, you live in Austin, Texas, you live in Miami, live in New York. It's, everything's kind of at your fingertips. And a lot of that is just because the ease of receiving and sending information in the internet. And that's starting to change. I think, Starlink opens up that opportunity for the populace to spread out a bit more. And like you're saying, places that are traditionally uninhabited will slowly become more inhabited. And I think there'll be a lot more opportunity in people spreading out and doing that. And I think it'll be healthy. But again, a lot of that is just because of access to information. Without Starlink, why would you live out in the middle of nowhere? I lived in a small town of like 10,000 people growing up for like part of my life. And internet was horrendous. Like it wasn't even worth it. People were still riding horses into town. Like it felt very, very old school. But I mean, if we had Starlink and we had access to information, we were able to congregate data better and into places where it's hard to access traditionally, then yeah, I think people will begin to spread out more. I think it'll be very interesting to see how that happens.
I'm the opposite. I'm like a loner in the middle of the woods with myself. I'd be the opposite, but not currently, but part of my life. And another thing, this is reminding me. I had a conversation years and years ago, and this was it was actually for an association that was representing the travel industry or the trucking industry. I don't know. It was the two very seemingly unrelated things, but we were talking about autonomous vehicles and autonomous trucking. So from my understanding then, and this was about the advent of 5G technology, but now we're talking about something far more far-reaching. But really, what prevented and has prevented, let's say, the autonomous vehicles from scaling, from just localized vicinities is one, the infrastructure for charging these things. Right, we have a massive in the U.S., but most of the globe infrastructure that supports gas engines, and I think that will persist, and it should. But when we're talking about autonomous vehicles, whether they're electric or gas or diesel powered, particularly the trucking industry, which is one that stands to be impacted, right, by autonomous or non-manned vehicles, it really is held back. Why that hasn't happened yet is not because the technology is not there. It was because the communication technology was not there to be able to keep those vehicles online 24/7, no matter where they are. If you're saying you're in rural Arkansas or you're going across West Texas and that vehicle loses communication and it's autonomous, it's not going to work or be able to continue to use, geolocation or location-based wayfinding technologies.
What if we taught the Tesla how to pull over and ask for directions using AI?
Yeah, I know, but it's one of these, not to spread doom of like, well, when this comes, but it makes sense though. He, in one of his other companies, Tesla, was working not just on consumer vehicles, but of course looking at ways to augment the trucking industry. And again, I work with people in terms of my speeches across the board, every possible industry, every possible discipline, job, organization, government, private sector, this country, that country, including that industry, right? Folks who drive trucks for a living, or supply chain is a huge area for me. And people are scared, right? I'm often brought in when people are like, oh my God, technology is like going to wipe us out. What does this mean for my job, my industry, etc. And I tend to be optimistic, right? I think it's like anything in the past and history, as we progress, new technologies come about and they change everything, and they cause a lot of conflict. They raise a lot of discourse and debate, in the same way that there were revolutions, after not immediately after the printing press. It took some time, a couple hundred years, but there were like massive awakenings. There was the Enlightenment and all of the stuff that came with that. There were, again, French and American Revolution. These are massive shifts in history, and we're in that moment now. And that's why the nature of the debates that we're having feel existential, and they do feel polarized, and they do feel kind of heavy, because they are. And not in a way of existential, we won't exist, but the way that we have existed comfortably before, in some respects, is changing or ending. And there are alternatives being built in parallel. There are alternatives of the traditional system as well to come. But I can understand there's a lot of fear and tension in the current moment, as we're feeling our existing communication infrastructure not just physically break down, though in some areas, like here where I am, which is an urban area, has the worst. You would think it would have really good internet, and it has the
Yeah, we
worst
talked about
internet.
it.
Yeah, but it doesn't. I mean, I can dox myself for this because it's a massive city. I'm in New York City right now, but because this whole city, it's like they'd go in and like split the cable 100 times, and you look around at the buildings and there's like wires hanging out, and they'll drill a hole, in the wall. So it's actually some of the worst connectivity than some of these areas that have kind of the newly brought in fiber, or of course Starlink. So I feel it. Like I feel at times, and I've lived in some pretty remote places or developing places where you'd think the infrastructure would be not so great, and it is in fact better than some areas that I've been within the United States. And again, I think this is an amazing opportunity to see innovators here, or any country, right, looking ahead and building the future, and building from new paradigms, building from new mindsets, and then having these debates about how should we structure and govern a platform. Like the question you asked before we got into this whole thing is beyond just the technological infrastructure and governance. Who owns this, right? Is it a government? Is it a private company? Or is it something in between that we have yet to define, that is emerging out of the wonderful fairyland of the Web3 communities, where we're seeing, more, like decentralized, or almost, I wouldn't say fully democratic, but new forms of community-based governance on the platform. I honestly think the community notes on X are interesting. At first, I was unsure about this, but now it reminds me of like a token curated registry. This is like kind of old school tokenized incentives to do this stuff. And I'm like, this is actually so simple of a mechanism, but I'd rather that than some top-down censorship, right? Like bottom up, like letting people participate in that. The problem is what we've seen in the past without like the proper incentives is that these things get corrupted as well. Look at Wikipedia. Um, I don't want to speak so antagonistic. I mean, I was blacklisted off of that in the past. I don't have a Wikipedia page despite many like a decade of a public persona, because I worked in an industry or advocated for an industry that at the time was considered criminal. And many of us are probably in that position, and it's now it's not, right? Now it's accepted and somehow part of
10 years ago, they'd look at us as nefarious individuals. 20 years ago, probably
Oh my
criminals. Yeah.
yeah, which is not, I mean, people still use these things for there are bad actors in any system. That I will not deny. However, you know, not everyone who comes into the world with a new mindset or a desire to change or improve something is a threat to a status quo. They could be, but they could also in parallel be like the Elon Musks of the world, who he's quite a divisive individual, right? A lot of people is love him or hate him kind of thing. And what I will say is to have the beliefs and the imagination and the capital and the drive to be reinventing multiple industries simultaneously at once is incredible, and it is offering an alternative to what we're now seeing with these other platforms. If we just want to compare like X or Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, and any other platform that is still quite easily influenced or centralized, thank goodness we have at least some alternatives to share information. I don't know how long that rodeo is going to last, unfortunately. But again, it just goes to show, with the example of the founder of Telegram, Durov, like there are many levels of that too, that can, what happened when he was arrested and what he was actually indicted for, and things that are occurring on that platform for sure, that are occurring on all of the platforms. I think where that got into that was not widely reported was also the involvement or use of that platform in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and kind of debates of the use of public platforms where we're getting into things beyond just protests like the 2010s, like Arab Spring, but also using it in active kinetic warfare and things like that. So I think there were some nuances in that debate as well that were a bit overlooked or intentionally overlooked. And what came out of that was basically a discussion of, are we going to start jailing people that have platforms that allow for free speech, or are we going to jail people or consider them criminals because they're working on actual end-to-end encryption or zero knowledge cryptography? Do we see cryptography as a threat when in the hands of the general public, versus the elite, the private companies or the governments that work on these technologies? Why is it the second that people democratize access to that tooling, it's such a threat?
Absolutely. It's very interesting because I believe in free speech. I believe in it at face value. Like, people should be able to freely discuss whatever they want to discuss. I feel like there are some exceptions where my opinion might diverge a little bit. Like if we decide to set up a group of 10,000 people and we're going to talk about a very specific topic and it's important to discuss this topic, and anyone can have an opinion on it, but then someone comes in and starts talking about something completely different in an effort to, let's say, just disrupt, to grab attention or to be a troll, I don't think that's conducive either to a healthy environment of speech either. And I think within certain platforms, maybe the stuff like that should exist, and moderation is a better word than to say, you know, it should be completely censored. But, you know, for small things like that, I do think it should exist, just because it allows people to actually speak rather than have someone speak over you like constantly, or have a conversation be hijacked, or, you know, those issues happen all the time on like X Spaces. Like I love to jump in on them because I love to hear everyone's opinion. And then someone gets the microphone, they probably shouldn't be in the group, and they just completely run away with it. And it's like, what's the point of this if we can't all just have a turn to talk about something, discuss, if someone's going to run away for attention? So I think in small circumstances, those things matter. Where I really get concerned is when governments start getting involved. And, you know, we're seeing that right now in France with Pavel Durov. We're seeing that in the UK, where they're threatening public figures in other countries that if they come to the UK, that they'll arrest them because they posted a meme and they don't like the meme. You know, some of it's religious, some of it's ethnic, some of it is just political, downright political. And even in Brazil too, where they pretty much kicked out X from the country, and Elon just recently paid a fine for it. But it's crazy to think you have these governing bodies that are supposed to represent the people as well, that are making decisions for large groups of people like that. And I worry about that a lot more when it comes to free speech, because they have a lot of control. And Brazil has like what, the sixth biggest economy in the world, a lot of people, and getting shut out from a platform like that, a free speech platform, you know, is quite heartbreaking in a lot of ways. And I see it. There's a lot of governments around the world that are going those directions. Venezuela is obviously going that direction too. There's concerns about that in Colombia. You know, I don't know. I think it's something that as people, we need to really educate ourselves on and try and speak up more and more, because if we don't, I think we'll live in a society where censorship is beyond even a platform's control, but it might just be a way of life where you live. And we don't want to live in that kind of a world.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And the meme stuff is terrifying to me because I mean, in some academic disciplines, right, mimetic warfare, like it is a type of psychological operation or propaganda. And I can understand, and very powerful, right, for spreading information. It's so condensed, and it's such a in group or out group thing, in a way to communicate without using the written language. However, under no circumstance should that be policed in a way that you're arrested for a meme. And that's happening now here. And I wouldn't say people arrested in the US, but being accosted by people, or at least paid visits. And, you know, it's sort of the time. This was in grad school. I took some classes all over the board, but one was called The Psychic Life of Media. It was about propaganda. It was super fun. And the focus of it was, fun and terrifying. And our focus was mainly the conditions, the psychic, so again, unspoken social conditions that allowed for or laid the groundwork for the Nazis to rise to power. So this was in between World War I and World War II. Of course, after World War I, the country had no money. It was in a really bad way, but really it was more about what was the psychological predisposition of the public that made it so easy to manipulate them one way or another. And it obviously, I don't like to generalize about groups of people, but you know, the German people are and still are very regimented, detail-oriented, fantastic engineers, great engineering country, and high
Quite
GDP because
huh?
of it. Quite interesting. Yeah. So again, not to generalize, like I don't want people to read too far into it, but it was more, right, that was the argument of quite a few theorists and authors at this time that were thinking, okay, what really was it? It was that they're lacking, or at least the argument of, again, these thinkers, so that the people lacked humor at this time. And we see this throughout a number of other examples throughout history of environments that start to cancel comedians or kill the court jesters. So again, this happened around the medieval times quite a bit. That's why Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales as like some big allegory, because you can't just sit there and be like, the king is bad. I disagree with the king, even though you are in the court. So you have to create not just one character, but 20, a bunch of other characters that you happen to meet and tell you crazy stuff. So there were plenty of different examples. But in the case of the Germans, it was like they were just not a people that were doing this. No, not really gravitating towards humor or irony or cynicism or satire. And we started to go in this direction, speaking from the experience, just me, my personal experience in the US, culturally, in a dangerous direction in terms of taking offense to pretty much everything and shutting down comedians, shutting down language through the comedians. And I think we're coming out of that phase a bit. There's a counterweight to it. And this is not to say that we should not be mindful and respectful of each other and like insult people, but humor is something that is so important to society and civilization, this self-referential self-criticism. Because if you can't do that collectively, then it does lead or create the environment that is ripe for authoritarianism or some sort of top-down control-based approach. So
there's an old saying, like if you can't build bridges unless you tear down walls. And
interesting.
one of the best ways to do that is through humor, through comedy, through, again, making fun of each other, breaking down those barriers where we get so, I guess, upset or offended, or we take offense to, or we get all riled up about. Comedy has always been something where we can take a minute to just make fun of each other, make fun of ourselves, make fun of our neighbor, and our neighbor can make fun of us. And we break down those barriers that we put up, and it allows us to, in a way, I don't have a better word for it, but kind of get over the things that, really get stuck in the back of our minds. Because how can we come together and build those bridges and have a prosperous society if we just hate each other all the time, if we just think so negatively? And you see the effect of that when comedy is attacked, and comedians in the US especially, for the last like decade or so, that just starts to get even more perverse. And it's like we have no medium to like release the tension, even through sports. Like even sports has gotten hyper politicized and has been pushed one way or another in terms of beliefs. And it's like there's not a lot of methods in which people can come together and enjoy each other's company, if we keep trying to tear those things away. So I do think that's another critical thing. If we're going to have a very prosperous society, we're going to communicate with each other better, and we're going to really thrive. We have to have mediums in which we can do things together: comedy, sports, entertainment, and media. You might believe one thing to the left, I might believe one thing to the right. We might be up or down on different issues, but we probably all still watch House of the Dragon. At the end of the day, it's like we align on so many core beliefs. Like our belief systems are very intertwined. It's just we have very small takes that we polarize to such a degree that we can't find those mediums in between.
But that's actually, you raised a really good point, is also the importance. You always raise good points. This isn't, it's not like, ooh, the only one, but the sharing of a collective consciousness or collective meaning making. So again, not to go through the full dawn of human communication, but a lot of this storytelling, even through oral tradition or parables, religious texts, etc., of course, created a sense of common, let's say, foundation for a belief system. And look at how many people fight over the meaning of words in let's say, the Bible, of the first text that was mass produced, and what that led to, and the splintering of factions and interpretations. what we see now. So again, if we're talking about various different countries, or even within one country, people moving to different places and platforms and seeking refuge here, then moving here, and having different belief systems, there's a risk of this fragmentation, right? If again we kind of go deglobalize, but in a globalized context, and we have people in Brazil doing their own thing, we've got Americans over here doing, and we lose this sense of meaning. And you mentioned entertainment, or you mentioned sports. In sports, all of these things as tools for globalization, tools for shared meaning. Maybe to excess, not a great thing. But when taken away, so again, in the media and entertainment environment, and this is a little bit adjacent to communication, it's more media, but I was having this conversation earlier today and it's fresh on the mind. If we're in this environment where everyone's going to have their own personalized AI generated content, and there's no more Game of Thrones, there's Game of Samrad's throne, and there's Game of Brandon Them's throne, and with your own characters in your head, like, how do we even relate, right? And it's like almost like this splintering. And so I think it's really important that we find a way for platforms that are connecting people over big groups of people to continue to exist, right? But in a way that is not enforcing some sort of top-down based censorship based approach. I mean, it's complex, but I think it is important that we have some sort of shared forum. We have a shared town square that, again, any civilization or spaces that were physically built around spaces was the proverbial town square, centered around place for commerce or the church or whatever was, built around a plaza. But this is where people would go to exchange ideas, exchange goods and services, exchange faith, and so on. So we're in this debate now where people are like dismantling the town squares, and all of them are so different, and people are, to extend the analogy, like warring in the square. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, Jack Dorsey used to talk about how he wanted Twitter to be like this glorified town hall, or this town square where people can come together and share ideas, share opinions, share beliefs. It's kind of crazy, because in order to have that, you have to have a community set on an agreed amount of values, which I don't think is hard to do. Because we can have the same values and have different opinions on how to approach those values, or have different opinions on just life itself and different things we want to do, but the values can still be the same, and we can still have community. I think it's that foundational structure of being able to have a town hall based around community of values that is starting to get infringed upon a bit more by platforms, by governments, by a polarized atmosphere. And I don't know. It's just crazy, because when you look at different mediums that used to break those things down, like, again, comedy, media and television or TV or movies, in the sporting world, like, you can see two people from completely different walks of life agree on the rules of a sport and shake hands at the end of the day. But, you go back to the streets and, you might hate that person. It's crazy. Like, it feels like people have more and more gotten away from a common set of values that builds a fundamental structure around what is community, that gives us things like a town hall, that gives us places where we can talk to each other and have free speech and not have to worry about this stuff. And I think a lot of that is also, again, government starting to intervene, a lot of corporations intervening, a lot of platforms intervening too much. I don't know. Maybe we just need to put everything on the blockchain, Sam. Maybe we just need to go full decentralized.
No, I actually, so having gone through that space, and a lot of when I set things up in a speech, a keynote speech, and to frame us of like where we're going in the future, oftentimes, depending on the topic, I do go through this sort of evolution of trust, which was face to face, where we did have these physical town squares in this example of communication, where we exchanged, again, ideas or goods and services. We didn't really need all these intermediaries. We didn't need like a Federal Reserve and global banking system because we were way more fragmented. When we shifted into a globally connected world, that changed, and we needed these centralized institutions, of course, banking, governments, media, platforms, etc. And so again, decentralization, blockchains, these ideas of completely like create a trustless world.
Let's blow it up.
Yeah,
let's blow it all up. Go decentralized.
I never thought that was the end game. I think Satoshi did, and some people do, and I don't judge that. I don't think humans are like capable of full on like natural ecological anarchism, not in like the scary anarchism way, just the way that like chaos order will form naturally from the chaos. I don't really want to live in the world where we just say we have no trust with nothing and no one, so let's just say screw it all and have, you know, some ledger and AI validate everything that I've ever said online and that it's my identity. And like, does this meme match the parameters of what's acceptable on our platform based on the user voting credential of what we think is offensive or not? You know, over automation of systems, over decentralization, which is the era that we're in. We're going to move into this era. So that's like coming from the AI world, the blockchain world, and all of it was done with the right intentions. And it's probably not going to manifest in these idealistic ways because, like any tool, they can be wielded for different things. So I'm now at the phase of thinking ahead. Like, what is the ideal system that combines elements of the face-to-face trust that we long for in local communities and villages, but in the context of a globalized, decentralized world? And this starts to look more like a federated network, or some of this terminology from the past where maybe there's sufficient decentralization, but not complete decentralization. And there are groups for oversight, or again, governance, or voting on the governance or direction of the platform, or perhaps the people own the platform. This was something that was a mission of a previous company of mine that was aiming to be a global communication network. We were based out of London. I learned a lot through that experience. It was some of the old, you know, Deutsche Telekom folks, and folks like people who created the Android operating system. So not the Google guys, not Andy Rubin, but the rest of them. And learned a lot, right? I was kind of a newcomer to that space. The mission for that company, in addition to having end-to-end encryption, true end-to-end encryption, not marketing end-to-end encryption, and privacy and people owning their own data, was actually to exit the company. So build it fully decentralized, where every user on the platform, which I hate the word user, so participant on the platform, was also an owner. So imagine 2 billion people around the world that each have some incentive or some vote as to the direction of it. And then think about how insane that is when you're talking about people from all of these places around the world. It was an interesting experiment. I really hope that they are able to achieve it. And I'm no longer involved with the company, obviously, but as someone who loves to watch experiments play out, particularly in startups in the private sector, because that's where cool new stuff happens. You know, I think there are solutions, and there are plenty of really incredible people out there working towards building them. For those of us who are just kind of riding along and using the tools, it'll be interesting. You know, I'd sort of prepare for more modularity, more changing of what tools you use or how you communicate, or where you exist. You know, for a long time, I had built social media presences under my longer name, which is Samantha Radakia. That's my actual name. And
no way.
Oh my God, it's Sam Rad. It's so different of a name. And there were things, again, of I wiped myself from the internet intentionally. No one did it to me. I did it first, in a way, just more like I didn't know if I wanted to stay in the technology space. And then I kind of built it back up, and I'm learning again from this new context. But when I think about, like, is it even worth it to build a, in quotes, following here when this place could not exist tomorrow? Why invest all of this stuff? And that's probably not what these platforms want me to be saying right now. It's like, no, 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 we want people to keep creating and posting and paying for the resources and fueling ad dollars. But I do have these thoughts of, like, if you build, there are plenty of creators, independent creators, that you're building your livelihood on something, and you can see how easily it's taken away. So I think ahead of, like, what is that future of these peer-to-peer relationships and communication or community, and where does that live? Does it go back to something that is a little bit more archaic or face-to-face, or is it, you see the popularity of something as simple as a text messaging group and on Telegram or WhatsApp, and there's quite a bit of pushback on those now too, from regulatory perspective, but also criminal activities, right? It's an area where it's very easy to point the finger and be like, who needs a massive 1,000 person group unless you're doing something bad, and unless you're sharing information how to scam people, which that's actually where a lot of fraudulent, like, people learn to commit fraud is, some of these things. But it's also not the only thing, right? Like, I might want to have a group of people I meet while travel. Sorry. Hello I just want to give a shout out to Shannon. Thank you for listening. I see your comments.
We see you, Shannon. Thank you for the comments.
We appreciate you. I see it, and it makes me pleasantly happy.
You're our first commenter, so congrats. You live in a special place in our heart for the history of this show as we go forward. We will share your comments towards the end as well. We'll reflect on it when we finish up. But to touch on your point there, Sam, and maybe this can also kind of lead us into the end game of the episode as well, which I think maybe is the future of communication. I think communication is going to be something that becomes much more intimate between people, something that becomes a lot more, emotionally driven, something that's also a lot more less exist. I don't know how to say it, but less than the way it exists today. Not written, not even vocal, but I think just received, receptive. And I think, and you talked about modularity, and I think the future will be very highly modularized for people, where you can augment yourself. You're seeing that with Neuralink. You're seeing that with being able to put chips in your head and connect to a video game and be able to just look at a screen and control a character. Is wild to me, but it's something that'll just be amplified continuously. And, the ability to receive information too. And can you imagine if we could sit here right now on this podcast without these microphones? I mean, it might be a sin to the public to not be able to hear it. I don't know if we'll be able to broadcast from our minds, maybe, probably. But us to have this conversation just from one brain to another without having to use a microphone in between.
So this is what excites me the most, because I think there are two different paths for this. And of course, I come from a perspective that is always and fundamentally team human. So not necessarily antagonistic towards technology, but more, how do we navigate maintaining and accentuating all the beauty that is this human instrument. So I think there is one path where there's a technologically mediated or digitized version of this sort of what you would call telepathy. So a direct brain to brain or cognition to cognition transmission. In that world, what's interesting and crazy to me is that all of us speak, think, visualize, make sense of the world differently. think a lot quite visually and visual metaphors. So, and if I was sending that information to you and it's like pictures in my head of things I'm seeing, does that get translated to some language? And maybe you are more like, I don't know, how are you? I don't want to tell you how you think, but how does information come to you first?
To me
Would
personally,
it be, yeah, like,
I guess it depends on the medium that I'm consuming, but it sometimes it comes visually, sometimes auditorily, sometimes through other senses. Like maybe you smell something, and then that puts a picture in your head, and you're like,
yeah,
"Oh
yeah.
gosh, the kitchen smells. Like I need to take out the garbage. Dang it, I forgot." Um, you know, there's a lot of ways that we can receive information, but there hasn't been a way until now where the brain has its own little antenna to receive and shoot out information. And maybe that's being a little short-sighted because the brain does emit its own frequencies and has its own wavelengths. Maybe it's like a radio and we're just not tuned into the right channels. You know, a lot of people believe different things, but I think from a practical standpoint, this is a very interesting arena to where we open up our own minds to the world of information we live in today. And that could have negative consequences too. Like I'm very optimistic and I try to think of it from an optimistic point of view. But, gotta wonder, can someone download a virus into your brain? Can someone convey misinformation or disinformation to you and directly affect what you think or what you believe? Or could you be manipulated one direction, one way or another? It's kind of a wild west in terms of how we are going to be able to communicate with each other.
So to answer that question, that's already happening. We don't need brain chips to have echo chambers put brain virus, brain worms in all of our brains. I mean, this kind of perceptual hijacking or influence has existed for quite some time, as long as we've had these different forms of media, especially more immersive media or music or visually stimulating stuff. I think what will happen is, and why, again, governance, decentralization, protection of your innermost thoughts, what's going out and in. You raise a good point. We need to figure this out before the ability to pervert, like the proverbial unplug from the Matrix, from the movie The Matrix, of Neo waking up and seeing the reality of the situation. We could be in an environment where we lack that discernment. So the other path, which is the more unplugged humanistic path, and this is actually in my day-to-day life, how I actually practice my life more, ironically, as a technologist, futurist, techie person, there's a period of time for 2 years I didn't own a computer. I got rid of all of it after my last company, just as a reset, but was also reacquainting myself with my human instrument, this tool, which is quite powerful. And I think there are ways. So before we started speaking again out of our mouths and through written language, there are other ways that we communicate, whether that's body language or pheromones or chemical languages, that we can perceive, whether that's consciously or subconsciously. And I think developing a sensitivity towards that versus an over reliance on, let's say, like a biometric measurement to tell you, like imagine if your smartwatch is recording your heart rate and it can record some chemicals, and then someone walks by and it's like, you have a crush on that person. Like, that's sort of weird,
How
it's
awkward
but
those situations will be.
meanwhile I've got my like little analog watch. I worry for that future. I'm optimistic about it. I think it's, there's some cool things. Me personally, I tend to go in a slightly different direction in terms of that balance or that moderation. And I think there are already ways that we are able to directly communicate with another person beyond language, beyond words, through feeling or through emotion, or even, as you mentioned, if as we learn more about the brain and the energetic fields that surround it or that it emits, I'm sure that, in terms of the parapsychology fields, whether that's the clairvoyance or the remote viewing, I don't share this often, but I have some experience and quite a bit of training there. I don't share this with people on stage to be like the really wacky futurist, but and it's really not like you're reading someone's mind. It's more that you're more sensitive to their languages of perceiving information. So it might be, in the case of clairvoyance, visual. So what is a visual metaphor? And so when I'm writing a book, right, I'm using maybe a metaphor that is tapping into all of the senses, and that's why it feels so powerful, so real. I would encourage people in parallel to work on the interpersonal communication with other human beings offline as well, and bring that into right, and bring that into these worlds and these environments, just so that we will all have the critical thinking, the creativity, the discernment, the intuitive senses, and awareness of actually our 5 senses to make sense of reality in these environments. Because one thing for sure is happening is that our sense of what is real or not, our sense of what is true or not, or factual or not, is certainly, it's being blurred. I wouldn't say it's under attack, but we're definitely in a situation where you open up a social network or a communication app and have to think twice about who said what. Is it a person? What is the agenda? Where is this source? Is this even a real publication, or did some, bot or person put this up yesterday with fake news? So again, all of those things, I think, tuning the human instrument, or what I would call, it's kind of a newer field of it's right now considered a subdomain of cybersecurity. I think it's entirely different, but it would be called cognitive security. So security of your perception and protection against
cognitive
this is sort of, I know I started using
the new McAfee cognitive protection.
this will be our product. It's actually shouldn't be like a thing you put in the chip to protect against the mind virus. It really should just be things that you're doing in day-to-day life that are unplugged. Something as simple as taking walks or getting sunlight or drinking water, cleansing the body. Just, again, it's good to be healthy, but to protect the mind in an environment that is getting more and more difficult to do that, I think it's certainly one of my top missions, to help people do this. And I don't say that to be to raise fear, more just awareness, so that if we do get to a point where these things go from our pockets to, again, our wrists, to our eyes, to our ears, which many of us already have augmented. If you're walking around, you might have some headphones in, you might have the watch on. Maybe soon we'll have some glasses. You're more immersed in that environment.
This is where my neuro background comes out, and I have a classic neuro Brandon moment where I think about, the fact that our mind is actually subdivided. We have a conscious mind, which is the one that we perceive ourselves as when we look in the mirror and when we interact together on this podcast. Consciously, I am doing this, and consciously, you are doing this, and we're having a conscious discussion. But there's also a subconscious mind that exists at the same exact time, that monitors your body and that takes care of your well-being. There's an involuntary and a voluntary aspect. And that involuntary aspect is at play every single day, and you hardly recognize it. Like breathing, like I can choose to breathe right now, but when's the last time you stopped and you had to really think about breathing? It's involuntary, just like so many other things that go on with the human body. And what I worry about with, connecting our minds is the subconscious mind becomes instantly vulnerable to an outside force, an outside reception of information. The same way that I can consciously send information from my mind to maybe a robotic hand. Let's say I lose my hand in some kind of accident. I have a new robotic, left hand. I could use Neuralink to connect to that so that I could actually use my left hand again, or to walk if I lost my legs and I was disabled, or to play a video game on a computer. In the same way, though, that information could also be used potentially to control your own body. And it gets really sci-fi, but at the same time, it's not kind of out of the realm of possibility. Like the same way we talk about it with autonomous cars. And what happens if someone uploads a virus into a Tesla that, you fall asleep at the wheel, the Tesla's driving, you're going from LA to San Francisco, and then something tells the car to just make a slight left turn, and there you go, off a cliff. That's it. It only takes a very small change, and most of your body, operates in an involuntary fashion. You don't think about the effort of having to walk or pick up a cup. Like, you just do things when you want to do things because it's involuntary, because the subconscious mind is there to take care of the small managerial tasks that you don't need to focus on. That's why there's a hierarchy in the neural structure. So what I worry about is, what if someone says, oh, take one more step forward and then there you go, you're going off the cliff now, or tilt your hand to the left and you spill the punch and you become the joke of the party. It's one of those things where, like every technology, there's tremendous opportunity and benefits, but it always opens up a new attack vector. And we have to be very careful about the potential attack vectors that maybe we open up to our own selves that have been closed off for the entirety of humanity. And our own mind is as capable as it is also something that is very vulnerable. And I can't help but reflect on that whenever I see Neuralink in practice. And I think about brain chips, and yeah, some of it might be impacted by sci-fi and Hollywood, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just the willingness of someone to do that. And would someone have a reason to try? And is it possible? And it's not science fiction anymore. It is in the realm of feasible.
Yeah, it's happening now, and people are, the second person who's been, is playing video game. I mean, they're both playing video games with chips in their brain. I mean, when we say this, it feels like it's in the realm of science fiction. And sometimes I joke that futurists are sort of like conspiracy theorists of the future. We just get to be like, I wonder when this happens. And it actually is anything that you see in science fiction, science fiction being one of, again, in the same way that comedy is one of the most powerful forms of manifesting or preventing a future, and actually helping people think outside of that box. What's important is that when we go out of that box, right, to say, okay, this is all the crazy stuff that could happen when, it's really a reflection on what's happening now. So if we're worrying about the control of the subconscious mind via an implantable brain chip, we really should be worrying about control of the subconscious mind with the dopamine hits and conditioning in hypnosis that comes from this device, and the notifications it sends, and the addiction that you get to it, and the infinite scroll. What an incredible invention back in the 2000s. From a design perspective, this was a lot of behavioral psychologists and some of the smartest people pulled from universities to go out to Silicon Valley and work on the user experience teams to design this stuff to manipulate the subconscious mind for certain purposes, right? For engagement, to sell ad dollars, etc. But if the tools are able to do that, and now people, whether they're just individuals, marketers, bad actors, state actors, whoever, anyone who has anything and a few minutes of time, want to start playing that game as well in the echo chambers, they can. So again, I'm not for preventing that. I'm not saying censor everything, because this is scary as heck. It is. And we can look outside again of the next 10, 20 years and say, okay, this is coming, and then say it's here. But I see it as an opportunity, again, for this cognitive hygiene, cognitive security, to take a breath and look at where we are now and look at the things that we can be doing to reclaim control over both the conscious and subconscious mind, and not just the thinking body, but also the feeling body, the intuitive body, the energetic body, the physical body, other insert body that I very scientific discipline here. Right. But
Mhm.
all of these different levels of awareness and ways that we process and share information, both taking it in and putting it out, that being communication and language, and getting in touch with that in a way that's not digitally augmented or mediated. So in that respect, again, I share your fears. Um, that's why I'm very passionate as well, from both the business model and governance perspective of figuring things out on platforms that are not so risky. Like, when we mess things up here, you can put this down. You can delete
Mhm.
Twitter off your phone. I went down a rabbit hole this past summer a little too far, too much of the echo chamber for me. It was actually impacting um, my well-being. Like, I did not feel good. I normally am an optimistic, happy person, and then there's all this like crazy divisiveness, mainly because of the U.S. elections, and on either side. And I actually started feeling like physically ill, and there were some other things going on, but it really is powerful, and all in the name of research. But um, we have the ability now to disengage. There might be a time where we choose to augment ourselves such that it's harder to disengage. Um, I don't think we'll be forced to have these things happen to us, right? I think people will willingly choose to augment themselves, but yeah, it's important to think about.
Yeah, I mean, if you're watching this, don't be scared of technology. Technology is not something to be afraid of. It is something that, if you look historically, has actually taken society a lot farther along than it has done any damage. If there's been any damage, it's been very minuscule or resolved over time. So don't ever be afraid of technology, but don't also be the one to just jump too quickly either. Like it's one thing to want to be a pioneer, to explore, to adventure, try new things, but don't just follow the herd either. Just, educate yourself, learn, be introspective, retrospective, think about, the implications of things. Because once you put something into your brain, it's a little harder to take out than, buying a phone. And that'll continue to escalate as we become, I think, more integrated with technology. Um, but always be wary. Always have it at the top of your mind.
I I love your closing statement. I agree. I want to bring it back to optimism. And
Let's do
again, going through the
it.
the history of everything, though, there are unintended consequences of every technological revolution. There are problems that arise from the changes in not just technology, but society, culture, geopolitics, or even before that was a word, just people, brushing up against each other. And we solve the problems, right? I think we've given this example previously, or again, when you're looking at this dawn of civilization. So writing is invented and we start writing on stone tablets. Now people start farming and living together in communities instead of being nomadic. Well, what happens when a bunch of people start living together? Dirty water, diseases, cholera, sickness. And so irrigation, movement of water, plumbing is for medicine, right? As cities start to, so we tend to progress and invent solutions to the problems that we created. And that's normally, that can be seen as a negative thing, but really that's the endless spiral of progress. And becoming more comfortable with that, of like, okay, there were unintended consequences of the internet revolution, or of even globalization as a concept. There were trust gaps. We put over reliance on centralized institutions that have numerous points of failure. And I'm not saying do away with those institutions, but um, there's kind of a rethinking of that now. There will be similarly challenges that arise as we go through this transition of, augmenting ourselves or even outsourcing our cognition to a language model, or an AI agent, or even a actual robotic physical form counterpart. Um, but and there will certainly be challenges, but I'm sure we'll solve them. And I think ultimately it will have to lead to a better humanity, I would hope. I mean, the alternative, right? It really is like a dark age or a golden age. There have been also dark ages in human history, or simultaneously, some civilizations dark, some golden, some kind of destroy themselves and then are reborn in a different location, or same location, different mindset. So, not to say that there's like a whole, it won't be like the whole world where apocalyptic ending. I think it depends on your perception. You could say everything I once knew is over. I'm not going to use this thing anymore to communicate. What? We didn't even have this thing when I was right. Like, remember the time when there were like phones on a wall that you had to, that had a cord on it, and we forget that things change, or like a pager. So we might not have that. Sure, it might take a different form. We'll probably forget what it was like before, which we shouldn't. But yeah, I think it's all good.
Everything's all good. We'll be humanity will be good. I mean, it's silly, the whole apocalyptic type of things that, people have dwelled upon. I almost call it like a attraction to drama, Y2K in 2012, and, all because like the Mayan calendar ended, or because we entered a new century. It's like, how many times do we got to do that? Where
Fear is
people
a
are
very
silly.
powerful,
Yes, fear is
speaking of the
powerful.
subconscious mind. I mean, yeah, fear is very easy to exploit. It's a bit more, I wouldn't say more powerful than the optimism, and that's again why we're here. It's important to address fear, but not get stuck in it, right? So it's okay. It would be a lie for me to stand on a stage or stand anywhere and say I'm not concerned about A, B, and C as it pertains to, let's say, the future of communication, like we've discussed here. Because if we don't discuss those what ifs, both what if positive, what if negative, we won't be prepared. However, I think getting stuck in that, and then getting stuck into this like post-apocalyptic fantasy of it's all going down stuff is not really productive for
Skynet,
anyone.
Rise of the Machines, iRobot.
I mean, even if that were to happen, we'd put up a good fight, and it would at least be a very dramatic closing of this chapter of the film. I mean, it's
I mean, I just hope that
I
if there is an apocalyptic event, I hope that it is Hollywood dramatic. I hope we can have a good fight before we go out. Like, I hope it's not just like, oh, a meteor hits and that's it. Like, I hope it's more. we
this is
let's
now
form
it's
the
morbid. It's
resistance.
like that I agree. I think that would be a really nice uniting experience for humanity to come together against something. But I'd rather we come together for something, for the benefit of something. For whatever reason, we can't seem to get it together. I am very excited. Speaking of satellites, speaking of previous discussions we've had on this show about space colonization or space exploration, it's been quite some time since the space race in the 60s, and like,
It's quite
at all of
cool, right? Being
it's
SpaceX
we need
announcing that we're going to go to Mars in 2 years, and if that goes well, humans will go in 4 years. Like, we're going to live potentially to see that. Like, that's crazy. Like, a very special
I've
point in time.
I've seen some of the imagery, some in just the past few days of from the rover, or a rover on Mars, looking back at Earth, and there was another planet, but it was reminiscent of that imagery, the pale blue dot, taken. I don't know when this was taken, but it
Voyager.
actually, yeah, it was profound. I don't normally, I'm not like expecting to have an emotional experience scrolling on Twitter, but I saw it, and I looked in greater detail and opened the image and was like, wow, because you're seeing the surface of this, Martian landscape. And of course, how small, this speck is that we're all sitting here on. But it's just insane, like, that we have, the ability, or at least like the desire to think ahead. And especially when we're, again, in these moments where it's so easy to get caught in the divisiveness or backward looking perspectives or fear-based perspectives, versus just let's look ahead and solve problems and innovate. And I'm really for that perspective, not in an unchecked, unhinged way where we like break a bunch of stuff, but in a way that it's like, okay, let's move ahead.
Hopefully we don't break stuff in the space race, because it's a little less forgiving up there. But it's crazy that we were able to do what we did in the early 70s, late 60s. And here we are today. It's like it's been put off to the side for quite a while now, but we're living in a very special golden point in time, I think, where we get to see the, I think, birth of not just another space race, but, space exploration and colonization, being founded for the first time, I think. That so many people would have, loved to be at a moment in time in human history. So I think we should really relish this stuff. Like when we see, what was the mission that was just called? They just sent up that billionaire for the first commercial flight, farthest spacewalk from Earth, Polaris Dawn. I think that's what it was called. It should have gotten more recognition than it did. It's such a cool moment to think like that we're sending citizens, like normal people, not just specially government appointed astronauts into space, but, normal people can go up there. And into very far points that people haven't gone in a long time. And then we're just a few years away from maybe putting our feet down on a completely different planet. That's wild. It's what's wild to think about for me.
Again, to me, what comes up is yet another example of technology or technologies democratizing access to information experiences. But this is information, right? A civilian going up there and taking a peek at something that otherwise was reserved, again, only for specially trained individuals or government sanctioned individuals. I think it'll be illuminating, right? And imagine then individuals or scientists being able to do their own experiments in zero gravity environments or manufacture things in those environments. I had wanted to launch a satellite of my own. This is a side story. A few years back, just a test. I was like, could I make my own satellite podcast? This is before I was like, I don't want to do a real one of these. I want to do a forward thinking one. And NASA actually used to have a program where you could like petition to launch your own like research satellite for a period of time to do certain things. And I never did this. Obviously, I'm not like this kind of scientist. But, even thinking about that, whether that's through Starlink or other companies, if they have like research-based approaches, not just for communication and satellites, but also when we have people physically being able to go do and have permission to do this in space. And do they need permission once they're out there? Or is it they need just permission for entry and exit the Earth border? And again, I'm optimistic that experiences like this, and now with the technologies converging, whether that's in rocket engineering or aerodynamics on like the actual vessel side, but also communication, right? That was probably something that held us back from spending a lot of time out there, going back to the moon. It'll be great to see this again and reinvigorate the imagination and the excitement, as opposed to the conspiracy and the distrust. Because, there's been enough time where people are sitting there saying, I don't think we even, went to the moon. I don't think we need these types of questions. I think we should just start be like, okay, let's go to the moon. Um,
I think we should wrap it up here. Shannon
yeah.
is still here. She commented
Thank you.
again.
Thank you, Shannon.
But we'll throw her comments up here. She commented earlier about satire and how that's such a great tool for introspection, and that was a good part of the conversation as well. Hopefully we can get some more people to comment and join in, because I'd love to take questions. I'm sure you would too, from audience members going forward, and kind of see what they think about these topics as well. It'd be fun to kind of reflect on some of those. So hopefully we can get some more people on the live streams.
Yeah, ask away. And when we started this, we wanted it. Oh my goodness. Can you see me?
You
No.
just disappeared. What happened?
My camera,
camera?
is. Hold on, I see if I can. You can still hear me though, right?
I can still hear you. It's just your camera. Up. There you go. More or less.
You want to see it? I'll show people the other one. I've got this, my Sony, which they do have a problem of overheating. I'm really surprised that we made it through this. How long was that? That was like an hour and a half or 2 hours.
Almost 2
Yeah,
hours.
this is actually much better than what I think this could do. But yeah, questions for sure. And we want it to be like like we're just in chat asking them the most pressing and provocative questions on our minds.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know what the topic will be for next week, but we'll let you guys know on socials. We'll think that one over, and make sure to watch this. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to subscribe, give us a like, comment any thoughts you have, share it with a friend as well. You'll be able to find it across all the other social platforms. We'll have clips up on Twitter, X, TikTok, Instagram relatively soon. And we'll also have this syndicated out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music. So if you want to consume it on one of those platforms as well, it'll just pop into your feed on a weekly basis. So make sure to go subscribe there as well if you prefer that method. And thank you for joining us as always, and excited to see you guys again next Monday for whatever amazing topic we have. Any final words, Sam?
No, we might need to syndicate to our own satellite system that's coming in 6 months. But we'll see you next week.
What, the satellite? It's coming.
Yeah.
All right. See you guys. Bye.
Bye.